Good evening, folks. Welcome or welcome back to Golem Telly. I am your host, the magical Mr. E. Now, we've got just a couple of shows left to go now until Halloween, and I really want to keep this Halloween theme going. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at a Judge Dredd story that's got a properly spooky theme. Let me show you what I mean. Here in my hands I have issues 15, 16 and 17 of the Quality Comics reprints of Judge Dredd from the late 80s. In these 3 issues you will find one of the creepiest Dredd stories ever written, City of the Damned. Let's get these issues over to camera 2, let's stick them under the retroscope, let's zoom in and let's check out this brilliant story together. Borag Thung, fellow Squax Deck Thargo. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. It's the first Dredd story to be featured on Golem Telly. It will not be the last. But as well as being the first Judge Dredd strip that I'm going to be looking at on this channel, City of the Damned was also one of the first Dredd stories that I ever read. Now originally it had been published in the pages of the weekly 2000 AD progs in the winter of 1984 to 1985. In fact, to be precise, it ran from Prog 393 to Prog 406. But I didn't read it in the weeklies. I first encountered it through the colour reprints that were published by Quality Comics in the early months of 1988. Now the first ever issue that I picked up was this one, number 16, but that issue actually starts midway through the story of City of the Damned. So I had to go to a comic shop and find the back issue that preceded this one, which was issue number 15, that's that one there, and that's where the story begins. And everything gets wrapped up in issue 17. And actually, once you get to that issue, you'll find that the story kind of finishes fairly quickly. The original intention of the writers had been to produce a real mega epic in the style of the Apocalypse War or the Judge Child quest. But by all accounts, they got a bit bored with the story halfway through and they decided to wrap it all up very quickly. So it actually ran for something like 14 weekly progs altogether, and the whole thing fits into around about 80 or so pages of these colour reprints. Now normally I'm not a fan of recoloured reprints, but in this case I really like the colours. I think they actually help to convey the story that little bit more successfully than the black and white alone did. The colours are fairly uncontroversial and they pop very nicely on the original newsprint pages. All in all, it was a pretty compelling first experience of Judge Dredd. And just for a little bit more context before we dive into this properly, at the time these monthly editions were coming out, in the weekly 2000 AD progs, we were around halfway through the classic mega epic story Oz. And that really became my formative experience of Judge Dredd. This was just an added bonus because I really couldn't get enough Dredd at the time. I just wanted more and more and more. And of course, also at the same time, I was buying up copies of the Best of 2000 AD monthly. Although, as you may well know, if you've watched some of my earlier shows, around about this time, March, April, May 1988, the main feature in the Best of 2000 AD monthly was the VCs. Brilliant story. Please go back and check my other shows and watch that one. Enjoy it, and while you're at it, why not subscribe to Golem Telly? I promise you won't regret it. You get 2 brilliant shows every week, and it won't cost you a penny. Okay, let's do it. Now, before I dive into issue 15 of this Quality Comics reprint of Judge Dredd, I'm going to show you something very interesting. As well as this perfectly standard copy of the comic, I also happen to have this. Now, you might be thinking, okay, a spare copy, but there's more to it than that. If I show you how the story is meant to start, you can see there's the title page for City of the Damned, but if I open this one up, what you'll see is actually the beginning of issue 17. So it's a misprint, and I'm guessing it's quite rare. Tell me, is it worth £1 million? Can I sell it and retire? Let me know in the comments. Now, with that out of the way, let's dive into the story for real. And before we do, let's just take a look at the editorial on the left-hand side here. I do love this Quality Comics introduction. Now this was actually designed for an American audience. 2000 AD was obviously a British phenomenon, but the character of Judge Dredd was famous around the world, and Quality Comics had basically taken over from Eagle Comics in a bid to reprint some classic Dredd stories for the US market. So the editorial begins, having spent a major portion of our childhoods in the 60s, England has always held a special place in our hearts. Oh sure, they gave us the Magna Carta and the Beatles, but we also got James Bond, the Thunderbirds, Emma Peel and John Steed in the deal too. Fantasy and quality meshed perfectly. It seemed the British took their daydreaming seriously. Now it's 20 years later, Bond's on his third retread, the Thunderbirds are likely collecting dust in someone's garage. It's doubtful Emma can still wear those leather tights. You might be surprised. And Steed's probably boring some poor attendant at a nursing home with past adventures. But the British still take their daydreams seriously, and their creations are still some of the best, as can be seen in Quality Comics. And they go on to explain that each month Quality Comics will be reprinting some of the finest stories to emerge from 2000 AD, including The Ballad of Halo Jones, Sam Slade Robo Hunter, Slain, Strontium Dog, Rogue Trooper, oh my god, Rogue Trooper, and more. And in fact, if you take a look at the back, I like doing this, of each issue, you can see the brilliant covers of each month's publications. And they were all new pieces of art. I forget the name of the artist who painted them, but it'll come back to me, I'm sure. Okay, so City of the Damned then. Now this story was so much fun. It's perfect for Halloween, by the way. It's got monsters and vampires and zombies. It's everything you need from a spooky story. Now here in this opening panel you can see the mutant telling all and sundry to gaze upon the doom that was foretold. And that prophecy that he's talking about here was basically that of the Judge Child. Unless the Judge Child could be found, the fabled Judge Child, whose real name was Owen Chrysler, unless he could be found and installed as the chief judge one day, then Mega City 1 would eventually fall into ruin. And that story was one of the first mega epics in 2000 AD, and it had far-reaching consequences that echoed throughout the years that followed. Nowhere better exemplified than in this story, The City of the Damned. Because what you're looking at here is a mutated version of the Judge Child, a clone that went horribly wrong. But we'll get to all of that in due course, I promise. Now, before I turn the page, I just want to point out that the art here is by Steve Dillon. It's brilliant artwork, and as you can imagine, being introduced to Judge Dredd stories back in the 80s through the art of Steve Dillon was such a fantastic way to get started. And of course, it's with a heavy heart that we have to remember he has now long since passed away. Steve Dillon died in 2016, and in fact, sadly, pretty much all the artists who worked on this great story are now gone. Ron Smith, whose artwork I loved so much, he died, I think, in 2019. He was in his 90s. And Ian Gibson, with his very distinctive art style, also died very recently, just a year or so ago. And while we're on this pretty morbid subject, let's get it out of the way. The co-writer of this story, Alan Grant, who had such an incredible partnership with John Wagner in the early years of 2000 AD, he also passed away just a couple of years ago. It's so strange to think that pretty much everyone who worked on this great story is now gone. For me, it feels like it was only yesterday that I was buying these issues and enjoying these stories for the first time. But we're here to have fun, so let's move on and get into this great story. Love those colours. You see, it's okay, when stories are recolored, sometimes it can work. And the story kicks off in the year 2107. I always remember that the timeline for Judge Dredd was set exactly 122 years in the future. And that dates back right to the first ever story, which came out in Prog number 2 in 1977. If you add 122 to 1977, you get 2099, which, let's be honest, is a pretty cool year in which to set any futuristic sci-fi story. And what's happened here is you got Chief Judge Magruder, there's Judge Anderson, side Judge Anderson, and there's Dredd, of course. And what they're looking at here is a time machine called Proteus. Now, the prologue sets up the facts on the ground very quickly and efficiently. We learn that Dredd and Anderson are to be sent into the future, 13 years into the future, to the year 2120, when it has been foretold that Mega City 1 will be in ruins. And these two judges are going to go into the future and find out if that's true and see if they can fix things. And as you can see here, it was Judge Faye who had predicted all this doom and gloom. And there we get a bit of a flashback of Judge Faye having this terrible vision, and Magruder warning them that if he was correct, then the city will face a catastrophe. And as you can see, Judge Dredd's no-nonsense attitude is shown here. Magruder asks them if they have any questions, and the only question that Dredd has is, when do we leave? Never been entirely sure what sort of voice Judge Dredd would actually have. I always imagined it would be something like Clint Eastwood's voice, but maybe a bit deeper. Sometimes it works to have Stallone's voice in there. I love the attitude of these medical guys here. They don't have the best bedside manner. They just tell Dredd and Anderson they've got to drink whatever's in these cups, and they only explain what the drink is for once they're already throwing up. The stress of temporal displacement will cause severe sickness. Better to get rid of it now. Nice. And Judge Magruder basically giving them free rein to do whatever needs to be done in order to avert this catastrophe in the future. Take whatever action you deem necessary. And we can enjoy some of this sensational Steve Dillon artwork here. The countdown is underway, and when it gets to 1, they engage and they have displacement. Fabulous picture there. The powerful engines spin Proteus forward through time, 13 years into the future, into the unknown. And they open the doors of Proteus to get a glimpse of Mega City 1 13 years in the future. Anderson says, I've got a bad feeling about this. A little bit Star Warsy there. And of course, this particular episode ends with their shocked faces. And Anderson crying out, sweet mercy! But you're going to have to wait a whole week to see what happens next. Not really, because we've got the Quality Comics reprint, and we can find out right now. What do they see outside? Oh my goodness. It's not a pretty picture, is it? And this is what I meant by the colouring. I think it works so well to have that sudden change from the bright colours on the previous page to this greyed out landscape of decay and death. And now the artwork has switched, actually. We're no longer looking at Steve Dillon's artwork here. Is this Ron Smith's? I think it is. That looks like a Ron Smith Dredd to me. But as you can see, there are bodies and skeletons littered about the place. And Anderson gets her first sort of telepathic image of the mutant, the threat they're up against. And here's a citizen who sees these two judges and panics. And Dredd and Anderson have no idea why, but he runs away and he cries out to them, "You ain't drinking my blood, you ghouls!" And you can see here he's called them the Blues. What does that mean? Well, you'll find out pretty soon. They pursue him, but to no avail, because in his terror, rather than be captured by them, he throws himself into an acid pool. I love the fact that there are open acid pools in this future Mega City 1. Anyway, clearly he had no intention of being caught by these judges, and he brings about his own end in a pretty grisly fashion. And there's Dredd noting what he was saying before he died. What did he call us? Hell Street Blues? And then he makes the connection with Hill Street, and he decides that that should be their first port of call, a sector house up on Hill Street. I love this depiction of the ruined Mega City 1, and that pub in particular, Limey's. Who wouldn't want to go to Limey's? There should be a Limey's in every big city, I think. And the squalor in which the future citizens are living is pretty terrible. Here you can see they're just eating whatever they can find off the ground, and they are also terrified of these blue-skinned devils, whoever they may be. And here they are. They are vampires. Now, I only wish that the colorist had painted them in blue here rather than this flesh color. It's not a big deal, but it would have been cool. Anyway, Anderson and Dredd, they witness what's going on here and they realize they're up against vampires. And Dredd asks, have the judges sunk so low? And one appears behind Anderson. without much to say for himself, but he's definitely a threat. Anderson tangles with him and calls out to Dredd, "What are you waiting for, Christmas?" At which point, Dredd takes control of the situation and tells this vampire to back off. And she has a quick rummage around in his mind to see if she can find out what happened prior to this, but she doesn't get what she's looking for, and Dredd deals with the issue decisively by breaking this vampire's neck with a karate chop. Crack. Anyway, they will find out what they need to know soon enough. Meanwhile, how about this? Isn't that something? What a gorgeous poster. Again, Steve Dillon here on the artwork duties. There was no artist like him. Now, those of you who know your judges will recognize this name, Hershey. She has a small part to play in this story, which is coming up soon. So Dredd and Anderson have made their way into this sector house and they're prowling around trying to find out what they need to know. They start up the old computer there, which hasn't been switched on for a long time, and they start getting some answers. "Computer, what was the date of your last data intake?" And Dredd finds out that the last data acceptance was on the 5th of January 2120, just 4 months ago. So what's happened here has all happened very recently. And at this point, we see Hershey. Told you she was coming. Now, Hershey... Now, what can I say? I was only 15 when I first encountered the world of Judge Dredd. And when I saw Judge Hershey, I don't know if you can have a crush on a comic book character, but I kind of think maybe I did. Is that bad? Is it weird? I don't know. I mean, it can be confusing growing up. Anyway, Hershey was absolutely beautiful, but here she has been kind of sullied somewhat because she's been turned into a vampire. I don't know. Some people might even prefer that. Okay, but okay, each to their own. Either way, she's not in the story for very long because she tries to bite Dredd on his neck, but he's not having any of that. And he socks her in the gut, and she goes flying, and, well, as you can see, he executes her. She says, "Never were the romantic type, were you, Joe?" And Dredd simply says, "No." And he blows her away. So yeah, it was a brief cameo from Hershey, but a memorable one. The vampire judges continue to pursue them, and they make their way out of the sector house. They free the citizens who had been captured and held as food for the vampires, and off they go to get back to their bikes. Now they speed away from the ghastly parody of a sector house, and at a safe distance they stop to play the tape that may hold the answer to the evil that has overtaken Mega City 1. And through a series of reports they find out exactly what transpired. 10:16 hours. Item: dense fog forming. All areas. Weather control reports no meteorological explanation. Psi Division report massive buildup of psychic energy over city, awaiting further data. And this is the horror that has arrived to thwart Mega City 1. I am the mutant. I am the doom that was foretold. I am the nightmare that is to be. Your destruction is my destiny. City of the damned, let chaos reign. And you can see the walkways and roads turning to lava or quicksand or whatever it is. The whole city is going crazy. And the reports continue. 10:19 hours. Item: major disasters reported all sectors. Events illogical at variance with natural laws. 10:22 hours. Item: Judge Anderson, head of Psi Division, orders massed mental resistance to the unknown psionic force. And I love the way that Anderson notes that she's been promoted. So it's a brief moment of levity in amidst all this horror. And we see here how the Psi department is collectively trying to fight this threat, but it's way too strong for them. And I think that's Anderson. Yeah, of course that's Anderson. Her head melts, at which point Dredd just says, "Congratulations on the promotion." Great stuff. Anyway, the bulletins continue. 10:25 hours. Item: occurrence at Grand Hall of Justice. And there's Magruder telling her judges to blow it away. But Mine is the power to warp cities. Do you think you can hurt me? And they realize they're wasting their bullets. And they ask what this is all about. What do you want here, says Magruder. To fulfill my destiny, I will lay waste to this cursed city, render it prey to the vilest of evils. And you valiant judges, you who have always fed off the blood of your people, so shall you continue. And of course, what he means is, he's going to turn them all into vampires, as we have seen. And that's when the bulletins stop, and we realize that the mutant has been as good as his word. Anderson asks what they're going to do. Do we return to Proteus and report back to their own time? And Dredd simply says, there's no point. He says, no, we don't leave here till we find out what this mutant is and how to defeat it. Let's ride. And off they go. Meanwhile, in the Grand Hall of Justice, a malevolent presence listens and waits. Okay, so that's it for issue 15. Let's get issue 16 up here quickly. And that's it. This is the first issue of the monthly Quality Comics reprints that I ever bought. So I think actually in this issue, they tell us in the editorial section who did paint those cover images for Quality Comics. Hold on one second, let's find out. Yeah, those who colour serve as well. One of the most important people working for us is the colorist for our covers, yet up to now she's received no credit. It's not right, it's not fair, and it's over as of now. Ladies and gentlemen, Ava Brzezowski is the woman responsible for the breathtaking watercolours, the pulse-pounding airbrushing, and the heart-stopping special effects that make Quality Comics stand out among all the others every month. Fantastic, great work, Ava Brzezowski. Love it. Let's just take a look at the other covers while we're on the subject. For this month, there's Rogue Trooper. I remember picking up that issue, and I'm pretty sure I bought Slain while I was at it, and I bought the Strontium Dog issue too. Oh, and I definitely bought Scavengers. Yeah, I was into it in a big way. Could not get enough 2000 AD action. What a time to be alive. So a quick recap, Mega City 1 2120, Judges Dredd and Anderson have journeyed into the city's future to investigate predictions of disaster and found a nightmare. Their desperate mission carries them onward towards the source of the evil, the thing that calls itself the Mutant. And Steve Dillon is on artwork duties here, and they're making their way into the city so that they can find this mutant. Anderson's still a bit unsure. Maybe we should cut our losses and head back to the time machine. But before they have time to discuss it, the ground begins to open up, and a series of terrible threats and challenges sort of kick off here. First of all, you get this ugly worm thing, and it attacks Anderson, bites onto her shoulder pad here. Between the two of them, they manage to blow its head off. It's still stuck onto her shoulder. The bike careers ahead on automatic, and she leaps from Dredd's bike back to her own, and they escape these awful monsters only to find there are even greater threats ahead. Look at this handsome chap here. A vile creature prowling the streets, but they haven't got time to stop and assist these beleaguered citizens. They must not be sidetracked from their grim, hopeless mission. But as they get closer into the city, they find a darkness descending everywhere. And they run into these citizens here, and you can see they're really suffering. We ain't seen real food in I don't know how long. Mostly we eat slime and scum and bugs and stuff. So it's not much of an existence. And they all share their tales of terror with the judges. The mutant's wiping us out, slow and painful. Soon there won't be no one left. This lady says skeletons attacked her on Heb Street. Couldn't get back to her block. It was sinking in quicksand. This poor guy says, it was my ma who got ate first. And this guy to his right says, it's the blue judges I'm scaredest of. That's who we thought you was, Judge. And they warn the two judges that they shouldn't go into the dark, because nobody that's gone into the dark has ever come out of it. Having said that, she says, I'm sure that won't happen to you. I wouldn't be completely reassured by that, but they're going anyway, because they've got a job to do. So Anderson quite rightly notes that nobody that's ever gone into the dark has ever come out, and that is a comforting thought. But Dredd reassures her that there is always a first time. Okay, well, if I'm going to trust anybody in a situation like this, then yeah, it's going to be Judge Dredd. So let's see what happens. Now, these poor creatures, they look like monsters, but actually they are wraiths. And these are essentially the souls of the millions of dead citizens. And this affects Anderson quite badly, actually. You can see here that Dredd notices that she's crying. And she says, "So what? It's not a crime, is it?" And she explains how it's different for you, Dredd. You've spent your life shutting yourself off from human emotions. You can't feel what these people are suffering. I'm a telepath. I can't shut it out. Anyway, the horrors continue. There are more attacks, more fights, more scraps with these monsters. Dredd takes another one down here, and when it seems like they've got no way out, they decide simply to go through the monsters. If we can't go around them, we'll have to go through them. And he blows a hole in this poor guy. And they ride through it. It's a brilliant image. Now, this is Ian Gibson's artwork, and as I said, he had a very distinctive style. But what you're seeing here actually is Dredd blinded. So even though they do manage to get past these monsters, one of them jabs its giant claws through Dredd's helmet visor into his eyes, and Dredd is blinded. So Anderson rides them out of there, and then things get a little bit sort of strange. The mutant starts using his psychic powers to change the city and twist the roads into a kind of ocean. And Dredd and Anderson are separated from one another, and Dredd has to continue alone, blinded, in this dreadful nightmare future of Mega City 1 in the year 2120. There we are. Dredd is left alone. My eyes, they're gone. A blind man in the dark. And he senses that something is nearby, and of course, as we can see, it's the mutant. He wonders for a moment if it might be Anderson. But the mutant sort of explains that he's been toying with Dredd all along. He says, "Anderson is gone, Joe Dredd, there's just you and me now." And the mutant explains to Dredd that he's going to have to go through an awful lot of pain. He says, "I made a mistake with you last time," because of course he's already killed Dredd once, and that was in the year 2120. Future Dredd is already dead. But he says, "This time I want to see you suffer. I want to watch you crawl on your knees and beg for mercy. Joe Dredd, Iron Man, I'm going to see you squirm." Dredd tries to blow him away, but it's no good. It's just an apparition. Anyway, he tells Dredd to come and find him. He says, "Turn your face to the heat of the fire, Joe, where hell burns, and that's where you'll find me." Well, Dredd hasn't got much else to do, so he decides to make his way towards the burning center of the city in a hope of finding the mutant and somehow defeating him. What do you reckon? Think he's going to do it? And this is a fabulous double-page spread. You can see the torment that Dredd is having to suffer as he makes his way past all this devastation and these monsters, and all the while with no eyes. I kind of feel like this would be perfect for Sylvester Stallone's Dredd to narrate. Should we give it a go? To be eyeless in hell, to claw your way inch by inch towards your goal, to keep going even though the terrors you face are more terrible because you cannot see them. Yet you fight on, heading ever for the heat of the inferno. And when you can no longer walk, you crawl towards the mutant and revenge for the evil he wrought upon your beloved city. Revenge that even in your pain-racked mind you know to be hopeless, for you are a judge, and it is your duty. Sylvester Stallone, he's my favourite. I may be the only one in the world who loves the 1995 Judge Dredd movie starring Sylvester Stallone, but I don't care. I like what I like, and nothing's going to change that now. Anyway, Dredd finally makes it to the Grand Hall of Justice, where he finds the mutant. He tries to reach for his gun, but a psi shield stops his hand getting close to it, and he asks the question, "Who are you? What kind of twisted mind could do what you've done?" And this is where we get the full explanation. Let me give you a clue. Once I was called Owen Chrysler, and Dredd obviously recognizes the name. He knows that that was the Judge child. "You thought you'd destroyed me forever on Xanadu, but you were wrong. My robotic mentor, the Grunwalder, had the foresight to retain certain samples of my tissue with which he was able to create a clone. But as the clone grew, the Grunwalder began to see it was not the Owen Chrysler he had known. Something's gone wrong with the culture, Grunwalder. We've created a monster. The mutant must be destroyed. Obviously that didn't go according to plan. And the mutant broke his way out of the, what do you call it, a vat? Bottle? Jar? I don't know. Goldfish bowl? And he plops onto the ground, and the mutant goes on to explain to Dredd, yes, they'd created a monster with a power that made my former self look like a Neanderthal. I want you to see me, Joe, and what a freak you've made of me. You don't need your eyes, open your mind. Open your mind. It's Quato, isn't it? Can you see me, Joe? Am I not hideous? Classic Dredd. You sure ain't no pinup. And Dredd is not particularly impressed by any of this. He says, so the little monster grew into a big monster and came back to Mega City to have his revenge. Faye's prediction was wrong in just one respect. You weren't the city's salvation. You were the very doom he predicted. Afraid so. Poor old Frey. 88.8% accurate just wasn't enough. And then, you see, at this moment, Dredd realizes that he's got a chance here. If this is all true, then this creep can be beaten. Now, having just figured that out, Dredd challenges the mutant. He says, what are you waiting for? Kill me! But the mutant, who is a bit of a sadist, of course, he's got a more ghoulish plan up his sleeve. Instead of just killing Dredd outright, he wants him to suffer. So, he presents him with the reanimated corpse of his future self. Joe Dredd, meet Joe Dredd. And there's the blinded Dredd from 2107, who is now going to have to duke it out with the zombie Dredd from 2120. This is a brilliant page, look at this. Take it from me, we're not much fun when we're dead. And of course Dredd recognizes, that voice, it's my own, my other self from this twisted future. And the mutant explains that he's going to have some fun at Dredd's expense. He says he wants to watch a hunt, one Dredd against another. And Dredd sort of mocks him here, and he says you still haven't grown up, have you? And he quite reasonably asks, what do I use for eyes? And the mutant says, I'm going to give you some eyes. And what he means by that is he's going to reunite Dredd with Anderson, so that Anderson can act as his eyes and be his guide. He says you can have a head start, teleports him to where Anderson is waiting. And Anderson, very honest here, she confesses to Dredd that she was so afraid when they were separated that she was going to head back to the time machine and try and get back to 2107. But that doesn't matter now. All that matters is that the two of them are together again. She says she's sorry she let him down, but Dredd understands, of course, that she is a side judge. And he knows that the mutant's powers affect her more deeply. He does not reproach her. Instead, he merely relates the facts of his grim encounter with the mutant. So she asks him what they're going to do, and he simply tells her in no uncertain terms, I can tell you what we don't do. We don't stop to talk about it. And off they go, and straight away they run into Zombie Dredd. Grud, he's in front of us. She gets hit in the leg, so that's going to slow her down a bit. They fill the zombie with lead, but of course it doesn't do any good. And he's up and shooting back at them, and we are told that this is going to be continued next month. Here we go, issue 17. Let's get straight into it. That's actually not part of the story. This is a poster. It's cool. Dredd in a spot of bother. Nothing he can't handle. So we get a bit of a recap here, and we can see the continuing struggle against the zombie. Anderson is trying to help Dredd aim in the right direction, and they keep shooting him, but of course he's not going to go down. He's a zombie. He's dead. So how can you kill him? The mutant here is acknowledging, you're a trier, Joe Dredd, I'll give you that, a definite trier, but nothing can save you from certain doom. So Dredd insists they've got to keep moving, they've got to stay ahead. They encounter more of these vampires, the blues, and here they've been coloured in blue, which makes them look a lot scarier, I think. Much better. Anderson's limping here, of course, because she's been shot in the leg. But they have to avoid these vampires and keep going. But it's looking like they're outnumbered here. Okay, Steve Dillon back on art robot duties here. You creeps used to be judges, he says to these vampires. You know me. Blind or not, you know how many of you will die before you get a sniff of my blood. And he orders them to back down. If you know what's good for you, you'll stand aside and let us get on with it. And Anderson says, I don't know where you did your voice training, but I've got to take a course there. So Dredd's got a plan here, and it's all going to be revealed now. And this is the point where the story starts to get wrapped up quickly. I mentioned earlier on that the writers were getting a little bit fed up with the story by this point, and they wanted to wrap it up quickly because they didn't really enjoy writing time travel stories. So Dredd makes his way to the teleporter room here. He says he noticed that there was one in the last sector house, and he realizes that they've obviously perfected teleport technology by 2120. So he's going to use that teleporter to get back to Proteus, the time machine. Anderson suddenly gets it. She understands where they're heading. And the mutant realizes at the last moment as well. And he wants them to be stopped. And the zombie Dredd comes crashing through the wall. You're going nowhere, Joe. And they exchange fire again. And Dredd does his best to blow away the zombie, but it still doesn't work. And the zombie makes his way up to Dredd, grabs him by the neck, and is about to kill him. And just as it looks as though, it's an amazing picture, isn't it? Gonna squeeze the life out of you, Joe. Just as it looks as though it's all over for Dredd, Anderson presses the button and they head back to the past. Now, of course, once they're out of the 2120 timeline, the mutant's powers are no longer effective, so the zombie just collapses and that threat is over. And they get back to 2107. And it's noted that they're in a bit of a state. Sweet mercy. So the medics tend to them as quickly as they can, and they also realize that the zombie Dredd has been brought back with them. And there's a lot of explaining to be done. Now, once they report back to Magruder, she thinks that basically all hope is lost. But Dredd says it doesn't have to be like that. And Anderson is also intrigued here. Dredd says the idea came to him when he was facing the mutant. He says that if they could go back to Xanadu, which is where they left the Judge child originally, and go back to the time when the mutant clone was created, they could snuff him out before he could bring his evil to the city. And then that future would never happen. So it's a great plan. I love this terrible bedside manner that these doctors have got. He says, never seen gangrene spread so fast. I'm sorry, Anderson, we're going to have to amputate. And she's like, oh, Grud. And he basically says, just joking, you'll be right as rain in a couple of days. Anyway, they board a spaceship and they make their way to the planet Xanadu, where the Judge child has been left. And there's Grunwalder, and he can't understand at this point how they know he has been creating a clone. Because, of course, he doesn't realize they've been to the future and seen what happened, and learned all these facts from the future mutant. They realize they have to destroy the mutant quickly before the judges arrive, but the young mutant isn't having any of that, so he once again escapes from his glass prison, and he plops onto the ground, but by this time Dredd and Anderson are there, and they know they have to blow it away. Now, there is some mild resistance from the young mutant. He puts up a sort of a psychic shield, but Anderson is able to disable it momentarily, and the bullets splut their way into the mutant's body, and, well, just to be sure, they give him a few extra rounds. And just to be absolutely sure, they take his bullet-riddled body and they throw it into this fiery pit, and the mutant is no more. And they also explain to Grunwalder that he also has to be destroyed, and Grunwalder accepts that. He says, yes, I feared as much. So once they're back on board the spaceship, they blast the place to Kingdom Come. And as you can see, this is the end here. This is the final page, so they really did wrap it up fast at the end. A week later, in the Grand Hall of Justice, Dredd's solution seems to have worked, Chief Judge. My precogs all report no recurrence of the nightmare visions. The future is clear. Thank Grud. But there's this neat little epilogue bit at the end here. In the Black Museum, Anderson says, you know, there's something I still don't understand. We changed the future, right? None of it will ever happen. Oh, and I forgot to mention, actually, that when they were getting seen to by the medics, Dredd had bionic eyes implanted, so he's as good as new. And she says, how come you're peering out of bionic peepers and Joe Geek here is the star attraction of the Black Museum? And Dredd simply and unhelpfully says, "Search me, Anderson." and there's a light-hearted moment where Anderson says, "Find myself doing 5 in a cube? You gotta be joking." No one searches Dredd. And that's it. That's the end of the story. It's a brilliant story. It's so much fun. And there is actually one final short story in this issue, just to fill out the page count. It's a one-shot all about Uncle Ump's Umpty Candy. It's lots of fun. It's all about the most addictive sweets in the world and how poor old Uncle Ump cannot stay on Earth because he's just too dangerous and he has to be sent far away into exile. Dredd rather unhelpfully telling poor old Uncle Ump, "Sometimes it is the innocent who must suffer." A quick glimpse of the other covers for that month. Rogue Trooper there, Slain, Strontium Dog, great stuff. Really loved seeing these on the shelves every single month at the comic shop. And that, folks, is that. Let's get the other two up here. And there we are, folks. City of the Damned as reprinted in Quality Comics Monthly in the early months of 1988. Okay, we're done here at camera 2. Let's head back to camera 1 and wrap up for the evening. I hope you enjoyed that brilliant story. I certainly did. Thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. If you could like and share this video, that would be a very kind thing to do. And if you could subscribe to Golem Telly if you haven't done so already, wow, what a gesture. There's one more show to come this Halloween, so don't miss it. I'll be back in 3 or 4 days' time. In the meantime, please enjoy the rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Evening shadows deepen, world around is sleeping, everyone's departed.